I remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it's been a while now. The test was the kind of opportunity that comes only once in a lifetime. I had just finished college, and the job was supposed to set the course for my future, something I had been working toward for years. But little did I know, that test would lead me down a path that I could never have prepared for. I had arrived in the area early in the morning. The town was small, barely a blip on the map, tucked away in a remote region I hadn't even heard of before. The buildings were old, run down, and the air had a peculiar chill to it that didn't seem to belong to a place so far removed from the city's warmth. It felt like a forgotten corner of the world, and I was about to spend the entire day in this strange little town, preparing for a job that would alter the course of my life. The test was conducted at a facility on the outskirts of town, located even further away from civilization. The kind of place that made you feel small, like you were an intruder in a secret world. I sat in a stark, clinical room, listening to the interview questions while trying to hide the fact that I felt like an outsider. The silence between each exchange made me feel like I was waiting for something beyond the job I was applying for. But that feeling wasn't important at the time. What mattered was that I had to pass. I focused, blocked out the strange discomfort in the air, and did my best to impress. When it was over, I felt a strange sense of relief, thinking the worst was behind me. As I packed up my things and left the building, I had no idea that the most unnerving part of the day was about to start. The sun had begun to set by the time I finished my test, and I knew I needed to get out of there and head back to the city. The town felt suffocating, and I was eager to leave, but my car had other plans. I'd barely managed to drive a few miles when the engine sputtered and died, forcing me to pull over to the side of the road. The silence of the surrounding woods was unnerving, almost as if the entire area was holding its breath. I tried to restart the engine, but nothing. I looked around, hoping to spot someone who could help, but the road stretched endlessly ahead, deserted. My only choice was to wait, and that's when I noticed the faint light of a building in the distance, flickering through the trees. At first, I hesitated. The place looked old, a small structure that seemed to be swallowed up by the wilderness surrounding it. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to see at the edge of a road, but I had no other choice. I grabbed my things and made my way toward it, the sound of my boots crunching in the snow the only noise that accompanied me. When I reached the front door, I was greeted by a soft creaking sound as the heavy door swung open, revealing an aging lobby with dim lights flickering overhead. The air was musty, heavy with the smell of old wood and dust. A man stood behind the counter, his face weathered with age, his features strangely blank, almost too still. He looked up at me with eyes that held a trace of recognition, or was it curiosity? "You must be the one who got stuck on the road," he said, his voice deep but soft. I nodded, unsure of what to say, and he motioned for me to come inside. "The snow's coming in fast tonight. It's better to stay here until morning. You'll be safe," he said. I wasn't sure why, but something about the place felt wrong. It was as if the walls themselves were keeping secrets. But my options were limited. I needed shelter for the night. I followed him into the lobby, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet, and he led me to a small room at the back of the building. The furniture was sparse, and the bed had an eerie, antique quality to it, but I was too tired to care. The last thing I wanted was to stay out in the cold, so I reluctantly agreed to stay. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that settled over me. The hotel, or whatever it was eerily quiet. The man who had greeted me earlier hadn't said much more after leading me to my room. His voice had that same strange tone, distant, like he was somewhere else, far removed from the world around him. I glanced around the room once more. The walls were adorned with old paintings, their faces blurred with age and dust, as though the time itself had forgotten about them. The furniture, too, was old. Even the curtains looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Nothing seemed to be in place, as if this entire hotel was frozen in a time long past. I set my bag on the small table by the window and, after a long day, finally allowed myself to lie down. The bed, though old and uncomfortable, felt like a small relief. My eyes closed, and I tried to sleep, but the silence in the room was too thick, too heavy. It felt oppressive, and the wind outside howled through the cracks of the walls, making everything feel colder than it already was. The creaking of the floorboards startled me. It wasn't the usual sounds of a building settling, but something deliberate, a slow, rhythmic footstep. Someone was walking outside my door. My breath caught in my throat. I waited, trying to listen for any other noises, but all I heard was the sound of the wind and that one set of footsteps. It was the kind of noise you try to ignore, convincing yourself it's just your imagination, but the longer it continued, the more unsettling it became. I held my breath, listening intently. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. My heart began to pound in my chest. I couldn't see through the crack beneath the door, but I could hear something, a quiet rustling sound, almost as if someone were standing there, just waiting. Then the door creaked slightly, as if someone had tried to open it. My pulse quickened. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated. I heard the faintest echo of a door closing, and the house fell silent again. But my mind raced, and I could feel a cold sweat beading on my forehead. What the hell was that? My thoughts churned, but there was no logical explanation. I didn't want to stay there any longer, but I didn't want to go out into the storm either. I decided to try and sleep, telling myself it was probably nothing. I lay back down, pulled the blankets tightly around me, and closed my eyes, praying that sleep would take over, but it didn't. Instead, I heard something else, faint whispering. It came from far away, almost like voices coming through a wall, but they were too distinct, too clear. "Leave this place. Leave." My eyes shot open. I froze. Was I imagining things? I couldn't tell anymore. The hotel felt like it was alive, breathing with me in the room, every corner watching, listening. I had to get out of there. The whispers grew louder, but I still didn't move. I couldn't. I was paralyzed by something, a feeling I couldn't explain, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in this hotel. I lay in bed, wide awake, the quiet whispers still ringing in my ears. My body refused to move, as though the weight of the room itself was holding me in place. The unsettling silence that followed the whispers was almost worse than the voices. The feeling of being watched didn't leave. I turned my head to look at the window, but even the darkness outside seemed to be pressing against it, as if something was out there, just beyond the glass, waiting. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination running wild, but deep down, I knew something was wrong with the hotel. It wasn't just the silence or the strange atmosphere, but the feeling that it was hiding something, something sinister, lurking in the shadows. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind, felt like it carried a secret. I must have drifted off to sleep at some point, but it wasn't the peaceful kind. I had strange, unsettling dreams, fleeting images of people I didn't recognize, faces twisted in pain, and shadows moving where they shouldn't. Every time I tried to reach out, to make sense of it, I woke with a start, my heart pounding. By the time the morning light crept through the edges of the curtains, I was already wide awake. My body ached from tension, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of here. I dressed quickly, my fingers shaking, and gathered my things. I hadn't planned on staying another night, and after what I'd experienced, I couldn't justify remaining any longer. I reached for the door handle, but just as I was about to open it, the silence in the room was broken by a soft knock at the door. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. I hadn't heard anyone come down the hall. Who was it? What did they want? Another knock. More persistent. "Come in," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The door creaked open slowly. To my relief, it was the hotel owner, the man who had checked me in the previous evening. But there was something off about him this morning. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a strange urgency. He wasn't looking at me, but at something over my shoulder. "Breakfast is ready," he said flatly, without his usual hospitality. His tone was hollow, distant. "I suggest you join us." I looked at him, confused. I'm sorry, but I can't stay any longer. I need to leave now." He didn't respond immediately, his eyes still darting around the room as if expecting someone, or something, to appear. Then he gave a small, unsettling smile. "You'll be fine," he said softly. "Just don't leave." Not yet. I felt my stomach twist. This wasn't right. I needed to get away from him, from this place. "Please, I have to go," I repeated, my voice growing more desperate. But before I could make a move, the man took a step closer to me. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I saw something dark and malevolent flicker behind them. "Once you leave," he murmured, "you won't be able to forget this place. It'll follow you. It always does." The air in the room grew colder, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I was trapped in that moment, my body refusing to move. His presence, suffocating and unnerving, seemed to fill the room. Finally, I forced myself to step away, grabbing my things as quickly as I could. "I'm leaving. I don't care what you say." I pushed past him, my heart racing, and made my way out of the room. The hotel seemed to close in around me, every step I took feeling heavier than the last. The hallway stretched on forever, dark and quiet, the air thick with tension. When I reached the front door, the man didn't stop me, but I could feel his eyes on my back, burning into me. I pushed the door open and stepped outside into the cold morning air. For a moment, I thought I might be safe. I thought I might finally be free. But just as I was about to reach my car, I heard something. A voice, soft at first, then louder, insistent. "Leave the hotel behind, but you'll never leave us." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I didn't even dare to look back. I slid into my car, hands shaking as I turned the ignition. The engine sputtered for a moment, and then roared to life, like the sound of a beast waking up. I slammed the gear shift into drive and peeled away from the hotel, my tires screeching against the cold, damp road. The fog still clung to the edges of the forest, and the trees loomed like dark sentinels, watching my every move. My pulse was still racing, and I couldn't shake the images that had haunted me throughout the night. Those strange whispers, the unnatural stillness, the hotel owner's eyes. I glanced at the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, following me. But the road behind me was empty, the mist curling like smoke, dissipating into the distance. I pushed the accelerator harder, the engine roaring in protest. I didn't care about the road conditions. I didn't care about the rain that started to fall again, drenching the windshield in streaks of water. I needed to get away, and I needed to do it fast. The miles stretched on, the world outside feeling more and more unreal as I drove. The quiet was maddening. There were no other cars on the road, no sounds but the roar of my engine and the relentless pitter-patter of the rain. It felt like I was the only one left in the world. Suddenly, a thought crossed my mind. What if the hotel hadn't been real at all? What if I had imagined everything? The strange sounds, the whispers, the eerie feeling of being watched. What if it had all been a trick of the mind, a result of stress, exhaustion, and the long drive? The idea that I might have been hallucinating made me question everything I had seen and heard. But then, I remembered the look in the man's eyes. That cold, unsettling gaze. The way he spoke. No, I couldn't just write it off. I knew something had been wrong with that place. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end just thinking about it. The road ahead suddenly seemed to bend unnaturally, the curves tight and twisted, like they were leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. It was as if the road itself was trying to keep me there, pulling me back to that damn hotel. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white with the strain. I'm leaving. I'm leaving it all behind, I whispered to myself, trying to reassure myself. But then, out of nowhere, my headlights caught something. Something standing in the middle of the road. My heart stopped. It was the hotel owner. He stood there, right in the middle of the street, blocking my path. His pale face was illuminated by my headlights, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. He was smiling. Or at least, it looked like a smile, but something about it made my stomach churn. I slammed on the brakes, sending the car skidding to a halt just a few feet from him. My heart was racing. I couldn't breathe. I stared at him through the windshield, unable to look away. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me. Then, slowly, he raised one hand and pointed. Not at me, but to the forest. I didn't think twice. I threw the car into reverse, my hands trembling as I floored the gas pedal. The car jerked backward, and I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had to get away from him, away from that place. I kept driving, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, watching for any sign that he was following. But the road behind me remained empty. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The landscape around me blurred as I drove faster, my mind whirling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't know what I had seen back there, and I didn't know if I would ever be able to explain it. But the one thing I did know, I was never going near that hotel again. Never. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the lights of a small town up ahead. I didn't slow down. I drove straight through the town and didn't stop until I reached the highway that would lead me home. The road seemed endless, but I didn't care. I just kept going, never looking back. As the hours passed, the familiar sights of the town faded into the distance, and the quiet hum of the car engine filled the silence. It felt as though I was finally escaping. Every mile between me and that hotel was like peeling away layers of fear, though I knew deep down that I couldn't outrun what had happened. My mind raced as I drove. I couldn't shake the image of the man's face, pale, emotionless, with that chilling smile. His presence had haunted me all through the night, lingering even now. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart skipped a beat, expecting to see him there. But each time, the road behind me was empty. Was it really him I had seen? Or had my mind been playing tricks on me? Maybe it was all just a figment of my imagination, born from exhaustion and stress. Maybe I had made it all up. But the rational part of my brain couldn't fully convince me. There was something undeniably wrong with that place. I tried to focus on the road, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettling the memories became. The whispers, the shadows moving in the corners of my vision, the way the air in that hotel felt so thick with something I couldn't name. I had been alone for so long, isolated in that hotel, that maybe I had just convinced myself the place was haunted. But those eyes weren't something I could explain away. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The long, empty highway before me seemed to be endless, like it was going to swallow me whole. I needed to stop, take a breath, get a grip. But something deep inside me told me that if I stopped, I would never get away from whatever had happened back there. Finally, the small town I had passed through earlier reappeared in the distance. I didn't want to stop, didn't want to acknowledge that it was getting late and I was running low on fuel, but I had no choice. I had to refuel before the drive home. I pulled into the gas station, the neon lights flickering eerily in the night. There was no one else around. The station attendant, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a permanent frown, stood behind the counter, looking at me as though I had just appeared from nowhere. As I stepped out of the car and stretched, I tried to push the unsettling thoughts from my mind. I had to get home. I had to forget about the hotel, forget about the man, forget about everything that had happened. I'd been on edge for hours, and I was sure that getting back to my normal life would help calm my nerves. But then, as I walked into the small store to pay for the gas, I saw something that made my heart stop. On the counter, right next to the register, was a postcard. The image on it was of a remote hotel, barely visible through a thick fog. It looked so familiar, so incredibly familiar. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. There was the same hotel I had stayed at, the same eerie building that seemed to exist outside of time. The picture was so lifelike, almost like a photograph, but I could have sworn I hadn't seen it before. I felt my hands start to shake, and I turned away, pretending not to notice. "Just the gas," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. The attendant gave me a strange look, but didn't say anything. I paid quickly and left, barely able to control the fear creeping up my spine. As I walked back to my car, I glanced up. Across the street, standing in the shadow of a street lamp, was a figure. A man, wearing a coat and hat. I couldn't make out his face, but I could feel his eyes on me. I stopped in my tracks. It was him. The man from the hotel. The same silhouette, the same posture. I ran to my car, slammed the door, and locked it. My heart raced, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I couldn't look away from the figure standing across the street. Was it him? Was it a coincidence? I drove off as fast as I could, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. The man was still there, watching me as I drove into the night. But as I turned a corner, he disappeared from view. The road ahead felt endless. My thoughts were spinning. Was I being paranoid? Was I losing my grip on reality? I had to keep going, I told myself. I had to get home. I had to forget. The drive continued, but now it felt like I was moving through a fog, both literally and figuratively. The headlights of my car sliced through the dark expanse of the road ahead, and the eerie glow of the streetlights seemed too bright, almost unnatural. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. I could feel it in my bones. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. Nothing. Just the empty highway stretching out behind me. But I knew that something was wrong. The image of the man from the hotel, standing in the shadows of that dimly lit gas station, kept playing in my mind. The chill in the air, the way his presence felt so heavy, so wrong. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white. What had happened back there? How had I ended up in that situation? I had come to that small town for a simple job interview, a simple task. And yet, it felt like I'd stumbled into something much darker. something I couldn't quite explain. As I drove, my mind continued to race. Could it have been a trick of the light? Maybe my exhaustion had played a role in how I perceived things at the hotel. Maybe the long drive, the isolation, the overwhelming weirdness of the place, all of it had clouded my judgment. But the image of the man, his presence so vivid and real, refused to leave my mind. Was I just making this up? Or had I encountered something truly sinister? I tried to push the thoughts aside and focus on the road. I was almost home. I could almost feel the familiarity of my own bed, the comfort of my own apartment. But then, as I passed through a bend in the road, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A car. Not just any car. It was a dark sedan, the kind you'd expect to see in an old noir film. It was parked on the side of the road, far off from any lit area, just sitting there in the shadows. No other cars around, no sign of life. The windows were rolled down slightly, but the car was empty. I slowed down. My breath caught in my throat as I passed the car. For some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was supposed to look closer. That something was wrong. As my car passed, I couldn't help myself. I looked into the side mirror. And there, standing in the shadows near the abandoned car, was the man from the hotel. He was staring directly at me, his face barely visible in the darkness, but his eyes, those eyes, were unmistakable. They were the same red, the same predatory glow, as they had been when I saw him at the hotel. My heart skipped a beat, and I slammed my foot on the gas, the car lurching forward as I sped down the road. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I had to get away now. I had to leave. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. I drove faster, pushing my car to its limits, praying that the figure would disappear. But the road stretched on endlessly, and every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw the same shadowy silhouette standing further down the road, always just behind me, keeping pace. Was it real? Was I truly being followed? Or was my mind unraveling? The sound of my own heartbeat thundered in my ears as I kept my foot pressed down on the gas. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped, caught in some nightmarish loop where I couldn't escape, couldn't find safety. I couldn't go back to that hotel. I couldn't return to that cursed place, to that man. But I also couldn't keep driving forever. I glanced at the rearview mirror one last time. Nothing. The road behind me was finally empty. The shadow, the man, was gone. For a moment, I thought I had escaped. That maybe, just maybe, everything was in my head. That it was all just a trick of the mind, an illusion created by stress, exhaustion, and fear. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I wasn't safe. Not yet. The night had been long, and my body was no longer responding the way it used to. Even though fear still pulsed through my veins, the need for rest overtook me. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was all just a nightmare, but deep down, I knew something was still lurking in the shadows. The next morning, dawn seemed even farther away. I got out of bed hesitantly, and a sense of emptiness overtook me. The house was silent, but an eerie sensation hung in the air. I went to the window, and there it was, the thing I feared, a hooded figure standing at the hotel's door. Without me noticing, the man had approached during the night, and now he stood there, motionless, waiting. A chill ran down my spine, and a silent scream filled my throat. My heart was racing, pounding in my ears. I grabbed my things quickly, and like a primal instinct, I got into my car and drove off, not looking back. The tires screeched on the road as I sped away, leaving the hotel behind. But even as the distance between us grew, something in me couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The fear felt uncontrollable, and the silence around me only heightened the sense of claustrophobia. My mind raced in 1,000 directions. Who was that man? How did he know where I was? Had he been watching me the whole time? Minutes passed, and the landscape around me seemed even more unfamiliar. Every turn of the road distorted my sense of direction, making me feel lost in a nightmare. When I finally reached a small town, I didn't know what was real and what was just fear. I went into a local cafe, trying to find some explanation. While talking to an old fisherman there, he mentioned something about the hotel where I'd stayed. The man looked at me with a vacant expression and said, "You shouldn't have gone there. No one who goes there comes back." I was frozen. What did he know about the hotel? And about the man who was watching me? These questions haunted me on the drive back home. With every passing mile, I became more convinced that the nightmare wasn't just on the road or at the hotel, but inside me. Something had marked me, something I might never understand. As the days passed, the weight of everything I had experienced didn't fade. The hotel, the man, the footsteps in the night, the old fisherman's cryptic words. All of it continued to haunt me. I never really understood what had happened during those hours at that isolated lodging, but I knew I'd never go back. The truth is, to this day, whenever I glance into my car's rearview mirror or see a solitary light in the distance, a shiver runs down my spine. What I saw, what I lived, it wasn't just a passing fear. It was something that would always stay with me. Now, more than ever, I know that there are places in this world where time and space seem to bend. And perhaps, in that hotel, something eternal and dark connected with me. Something that will never fade. I remember that night vividly. It was years ago, but the events remain etched in my mind as if they happened yesterday. At the time, I was traveling for work, a long drive through unfamiliar roads late at night. The rain was relentless, pounding against the windshield and obscuring my view. Every mile seemed to stretch into an eternity, and exhaustion weighed on me like a heavy blanket. I needed to rest. When I saw the dimly lit sign for a roadside inn, I didn't hesitate. It wasn't the kind of place you'd pick for a vacation. Small, isolated, with peeling paint on its wooden facade, but it was a haven compared to the storm raging outside. As I pulled into the gravel parking lot, the rain turned into a torrential downpour, and I dashed inside, clutching my coat against the icy wind. The reception area was modest, almost quaint. A wooden counter stood near the entrance, and a dim chandelier hung above, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Behind the counter, a woman with gray-streaked hair and a lined face greeted me with a tired smile. "Room 7, she said, handing me a rusted key attached to a wooden tag. "The rooms on either side are empty, so it should be quiet." Her voice had a strange undertone, almost dismissive, as if she wanted the conversation to end quickly. The hallway leading to the rooms was dimly lit, the bulbs flickering as I walked. Room 7 was near the end. The door creaked as I opened it, revealing a small room with a single bed, a bedside table, and a lamp. It smelled of damp wood and old linens, but at that moment, it felt like a sanctuary. The rain outside continued to batter the windows as I settled in. The bed was lumpy, and the sheets had the faint scent of mothballs, but I was too tired to care. I turned off the lamp and let the darkness envelop the room, the sound of the storm becoming a soothing backdrop to my impending sleep. I don't know how long I had been lying there when I first heard it, a rhythmic tapping, faint but persistent. It came from the wall to my left, the one separating room 7 from room 8. My initial thought was that the wind was somehow causing it, or maybe there was an old pipe rattling inside the wall. But the noise didn't stop. It grew louder, as if someone, or something, was tapping directly on the other side. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The receptionist had said the other rooms were empty. Surely, I thought, she must have been mistaken. The sound stopped as abruptly as it started, leaving me in an eerie silence. I lay back down, trying to convince myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my ears. But as soon as I began to drift off again, the tapping returned, this time accompanied by a faint scratching, like nails dragging along the wall. I sat up once more, this time feeling a chill run down my spine. The storm outside seemed to quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I stared at the wall, half expecting it to move, to crack open and reveal something. But nothing happened. Instead of investigating, I stayed frozen in place, gripping the thin blanket as if it could shield me from whatever was causing the noise. The night dragged on, each minute longer than the last. The sounds from the other side of the wall eventually stopped, but the unease lingered. I tried to convince myself that it was just an old building settling, that the storm had made my mind jump to conclusions. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By morning, the rain had stopped. The sun had begun to filter through the curtains, casting a pale light across the room. I had hardly slept, but I decided to leave the room and grab some breakfast downstairs, hoping to shake off the sense of dread that had settled over me. The old woman at the front desk wasn't there, but the kitchen was still warm from the night before. As I sat at the table, sipping on stale coffee, I glanced around. Everything in the lobby was old, worn, and dusty, just like the room. But something felt different now, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When I finished my coffee, I decided to investigate the source of the sounds. I hadn't noticed it the night before, but as I walked down the hallway, I realized the door to room 8 was slightly ajar. My curiosity got the best of me. I pushed the door open. The room was empty, but it was as if someone had just been there. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled, and a small piece of paper was lying on the floor. I picked it up, the paper crinkling in my hands. It was an old receipt, nothing out of the ordinary, but something about it caught my attention. It was dated for the previous night, the same night I had stayed in room 7. The handwriting on it was rushed, barely legible, and the name scribbled at the bottom was unfamiliar. I looked around, wondering if this was some kind of prank. But no one else seemed to be around, and the eerie quiet of the building only heightened my growing sense of unease. The more I thought about the strange occurrences of the night before, the more convinced I became that something wasn't right. The rest of the day passed in a blur of unease, and as night fell again, the dread I had been pushing aside came back in full force. I had intended to leave, but the storm outside grew stronger, and I found myself trapped once more in the same old room, the same strange feeling of being watched hanging in the air. I couldn't shake the idea that someone was watching me. I kept glancing toward the window, convinced I'd see someone standing there, just out of view. But when I did look, there was nothing. I tried to convince myself to sleep, but the noise from last night, tapping, scraping, began again. Faint, at first, but growing steadily louder. This time, it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was in the room next door. The tapping was followed by soft muttering, words I couldn't understand. It sounded like a voice, but not a human one. Against my better judgment, I got up and approached the window. I pulled back the curtain, half expecting to see nothing. But what I saw made my blood run cold. Outside, illuminated by the pale light of the full moon, was a figure. It was standing motionless, just beyond the edge of the parking lot, in the trees. A man. But something was off. He wore a long, dark coat, and his face was hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. The more I stared, the more I realized that this figure was eerily still, almost like a mannequin. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. Had he been standing there the entire time? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I took a deep breath, tried to calm myself, but I couldn't. There was something unnatural about this figure. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to the events of last night. I turned away from the window and went to the door. I had to leave. The unease had become unbearable. But when I reached the door, something stopped me. The unmistakable sound of a knock echoed through the room, sharp and insistent. I froze. The knock came again, louder this time, shaking the old wood of the door. My heart raced as I stood frozen, staring at the worn, chipped surface of the door. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, too heavy to lift. For a moment, the world around me seemed to close in, just the sound of that knock echoing through my mind. I told myself it was just a prank, a stupid trick. Someone from the inn, maybe the elderly woman, playing games. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had never felt so sure that something wasn't right. The knocking came a third time. Each strike against the door sent a shiver through me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, my mind screaming at me to turn and run. But curiosity, or perhaps something darker, kept me rooted to the spot. I opened the door slowly, just a crack. The hallway outside was empty, eerily quiet. But something caught my eye, the faintest glimmer in the shadows at the end of the hall. I stepped out cautiously, my breath shallow. The air was colder now, and it smelled of damp wood and something metallic, like blood. My mind screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me forward. As I walked down the hallway, the temperature dropped further, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of eyes on me. I glanced over my shoulder, but no one was there. The hallway stretched on, endless and silent, until I reached the end. At the far end, the door to room 8 stood ajar, just like it had been earlier. But now, it looked different. The room felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I couldn't stop myself. I stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the small lamp beside the bed. But it wasn't the room that made my blood run cold. It was what was on the floor. A trail of muddy footprints led across the carpet, streaking from the door to the center of the room. And there, in the middle, was the figure from outside. The man. The one in the wide-brimmed hat and long coat. But now, he wasn't standing outside. He was inside the room. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears as I backed away. My mind screamed for me to run, to get out of there, but my feet refused to move. The man's head tilted ever so slightly, and I could swear I saw a glint of something red beneath the brim of his hat. His eyes. Those eyes. The air grew thick with dread as the man slowly took a step toward me. The hairs on my arms stood up, and my breathing became shallow, erratic. I knew, without a doubt, that I was in the presence of something that shouldn't exist. Then, without warning, he reached out, a long, thin hand, fingers twisted and unnaturally long, like they didn't belong. I stumbled back, my mind frantically searching for an escape, but I couldn't move fast enough. My body felt heavy, like I was trapped in quicksand. But just as his fingers brushed against my shoulder, the world seemed to shift. Suddenly, I was back in my room. The door was closed, and the man was gone. I gasped for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around wildly, but there was nothing. No footprints, no figure. Just the quiet stillness of the room. I stumbled backward, falling onto the bed. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been a dream? Had I imagined it all? But the fear still gripped me, tight and unrelenting. I stared at the door. The knock was gone, but the unease lingered. I wasn't alone anymore. The rest of the night dragged on, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind howling outside, but the silence in the room was even louder. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the air, felt like the presence of something watching. When morning finally came, I bolted upright, sweat pouring down my face. I hadn't slept a wink. The sunlight filtering through the curtains did little to ease my paranoia. My body felt like it had been awake for days. I had to leave. I packed my things quickly, almost frantically, as though if I moved fast enough, I could outrun whatever had happened the night before. But the nagging feeling remained, the sense that I was being followed, that something was still there. As I stepped into the hallway, I glanced toward the stairs. The front door was at the bottom of the stairs, my escape route. But something caught my eye, something I hadn't noticed before. There, at the end of the hall, standing just inside the doorway to room 8, was the figure, the man. He was standing still, just as he had been before, only this time I could see more clearly. His coat was tattered and stained, and his eyes, those glowing red eyes, shone brightly in the dim light. He wasn't moving. He was watching me. The fear gripped me so tightly I couldn't breathe. I didn't care about my things, about the room, or about anything else. I just had to get out of there. I turned and ran, bolting down the stairs and out the front door without a second thought. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face, but it didn't matter. I just needed to get away. I jumped into my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine sputtered to life, and I sped off, not daring to look back. As I drove away, I could have sworn I saw the figure standing by the window of the inn, watching me leave. And even now, years later, I still don't know if I was just losing my mind, or if something truly was waiting for me in that old inn. I've never been able to forget the eyes. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.